He saw fat Satan hanging over the forest, its bloody disc half obscured by a screen of blue-black branches. Nearby, a single yellow sun burned very brightly, a small spark in the firmament. He blinked at them. They were old friends. The sound of Braith hounds brought him back to attention. 10 meters away, the hunters came eagerly out of the foliage. Not as close as he had expected them. Of course, he thought, they had gone around the chokers instead of fighting through them. Pyre Braith was almost invisible, blue-black like the tree he stood against. But Dirk saw his motion, and the baton he carried in one hand, and the bright silver shaft taller than he that he held in the other. His tame was a few steps ahead of him, holding 2 hounds on short chains. The dogs were barking wildly and pulling him forward almost at a trot. A third hound ran free at his side and began bounding toward the downed air car as soon as it was out of the underbrush. Dirk, lying on his stomach amid the ashes and the shattered instruments of the wreck, suddenly found it all immensely funny. Pyre hefted his silver shaft above his head and began to run. He was sure he had his prey at last, but he had no laser, and Dirk did. Giggling and giddy, Dirk raised the rifle and took careful aim. As he fired, a memory came back to him, as sudden and stabbing as the pulse of light that flashed from his laser. Janasek, just a short time ago, was stern-faced, shrugging. "Your life may depend on how fast and straight you can run, and how accurately you can fire your rifle," he had said. And Dirk had added, "and whether I can kill." It had seemed terribly important, the killing. How much more difficult it would be than simple running. He giggled again. The running had been very difficult. The killing was just something he did, and it was almost easy. The bright burning knife of the laser hung in the air for a long second, impaling Pyre square in his broad gut as he ran toward the hulk. The Braith stumbled and fell to his knees. His mouth hung open absurdly for a second before he collapsed on his face and was lost to Dirk's sight. The long silver blade he had carried remained stuck in the torn ground, swaying back and forth as the wind whipped at it. Pyre's black-haired companion let go of the chain he was holding and seemed to freeze when his tane went down. Dirk moved the laser slightly and fired once more, but nothing happened. The weapon was still in its 15-second recycle. That made the hunting a sport, he remembered. It gave the game a chance to get away if you missed. He found himself giggling again. The hunter woke up and threw himself flat, rolling over the ground into the long gully ripped by the air car's wing. Down in the trenches looking for his laser, Dirk thought, but he won't find it. The hounds had surrounded the air car, barking at him whenever he shifted his position or raised his head. None of them tried to come in for the kill. That was the hunter's business. Dirk took careful aim and shot the nearest one through the throat. It dropped like dead meat, and the other 2 backed off. Pulling himself to his knees, Dirk crawled out of his shelter. He tried to stand, steadying himself with one hand on the twisted wing. The world was spinning. Savage, stabbing pains ran up his legs, and he found he could no longer feel his feet at all. But somehow he kept himself erect. A shout rang out, something in old Kevlar. Dirk did not know the word. The huge hounds charged, one right after the other, wet red mouths agape, snarling. And in the corner of his eye he saw the hunter emerging 2 meters away, his knife out already. One of his long, thin arms flicked it around in a sideways sort of motion, and it clattered off the air car wing Dirk was leaning against. Already the man had turned and was running, and the nearest hound was there, in the air. Dirk let himself fall and brought up the rifle. The canine snapped, missed, but the beast's body smashed into him, knocking him spinning, and then it was on top of him in the dust. Somehow he found the trigger. There was a brief light and the smell of wet hair burning, then an awful whine. The hound snapped again, feebly, choking on its own blood. Dirk pushed the carcass off and struggled to one knee. The Braith had reached Pyre's body and was lifting the long silver blade. The other hound had caught its loose chain on a jagged edge of the wreck. When Dirk rose, it yelped and lunged. The whole great burned hulk of the air car seemed to shake a little and move, but still the beast was caught. The black-haired hunter had the silver thing. Dirk aimed his laser and fired. The beam burned wide, but a second is long enough, and Dirk swung the rifle sharply, right to left, left to right. The man fell even as he released his weapon. It sailed a few meters, slid off the twisted wing, and stuck in the ground, where it moved back and forth in the wind. Dirk was still swinging his laser, left, right, left, right, left, right, long after the hunter had fallen and the light had gone out. Finally it recycled and pulsed again for a second, burning nothing but a row of chokers, and Dirk, startled, released his hold on the trigger and dropped the weapon. The hound, still caught, was snarling and lunging. Dirk looked at it, open-mouthed, almost uncomprehending. Then he giggled. He got down on his knees, found the laser, and began to crawl toward the cavallars. It took an awfully long time. His feet hurt, his arm as well, where he had been bitten. The hound finally fell silent, but there was no quiet. Dirk could hear crying, a continuous low whimper. He dragged himself through the dirt and the ashes, over the burnt-out trunk of a choker, to where the hunters had fallen. They were lying side by side. The gaunt one, the one whose name he had never learned, who had tried to kill him with his knife and his dogs and his silver blade, that one was still. His mouth was full of blood. Pyre, lying face down, was the source of the whimpers. Dirk knelt by him, shoved his hands beneath him, laboriously turned him over. His face was covered with ashes and blood. He had smashed his nose when he fell, and a thin red trickle still ran from one nostril, leaving a bright trail across his soot-smeared cheeks. His face was old. He kept whimpering and did not seem to see Dirk at all, and his hands were clutching his stomach. Dirk stared at him for a long time. He touched one of his hands. It was strangely soft and small, clean except for a single black slash that ran across the palm. Almost a child's hand that ought not to belong to that old bald face, and lifted it away and did the same with the other hand and looked at the hole he had burned in Pyre's gut. A big gut and a small dark hole. It ought not to have hurt him so much. No blood either, except from his nose. That was almost funny, but Dirk discovered he had no more giggles left in him. Pyre opened his mouth then, and Dirk wondered if the man was trying to tell him something, some last words perhaps, some plea for forgiveness, but the breath only made a thick, choking sound, and then resumed his low whimpers. His baton was lying nearby. Dirk took it up and wrapped his hands around the hardwood knob at one end, and placed the small blade over Pyre's chest where his heart ought to be, and leaned all his weight forward and down, thinking to give the other release. The hunter's heavy body thrashed horribly for an instant, and Dirk withdrew the blade and thrust it in again, and yet again, but Pyre would not keep still. The little blade was too short, Dirk decided after a time, so he used it differently, found an artery in Pyre's fleshy throat, held the baton very tightly right up by the knife end, and pressed it in through the pale, fatty skin. There was a terrible lot of blood then, a spurting stream that caught Dirk right in the face until he let go of the baton and pushed himself away. Pyre thrashed again, and his neck continued to spurt where Dirk had cut him, and Dirk watched, but each spurt was a little feebler than the one before, and after a time the fountain was only a trickle, and after another time it seemed to stop. The ashes and the dirt drank up a lot of the blood, but there was still a great deal of it around, a regular little pool of it between the two of them, and Dirk had never known that a man had enough blood in him to form a real pool of blood. He felt very sick, but at least Pyre was still, and the whimpering had stopped. He sat alone, resting, in the wan red light. He was very hot and very cold all at once, and he knew he should take some clothing from the corpses and cover himself, but he could not find the strength. His feet hurt horribly, and his arm had swollen to twice its normal size. He did not sleep, but he was barely conscious. He watched Fat Satan rise higher and higher in the sky, approaching noon, with the bright yellow sun shining painfully around it. He heard the braithhound howling several times, and once he listened to the eerie hunting wail of the banshee and wondered if the creature would come back to eat him and the men he had killed. But the cry seemed a long way off, and perhaps it was only his fever, and perhaps it was only the wind. When the sticky wet film on his face had dried to a brown crust and the little pool of blood that lay in the dust was finally gone, Dirk knew that he must move again, or he would die here. He considered dying for a long time. It seemed like a very good idea somehow, but he could not bring himself to do it. He remembered Gwen. He crawled over to where the body of Pius Tane was lying, ignoring his pain as best he could, and went through the man's pockets. He found the whisper jewel. Ice in his fist, ice in his mind, memories of promises, lies, love. Jenny, my Guinevere, and he was Lancelot. He could not fail her. He could not. He crushed the cold teardrop hard in his hand and took the ice into his soul.